name's Kirsten Patterson, or KP. I'm your New Zealand Country Head for Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. Welcome to Future Inc. I'm excited and privileged to have so many of you join us today for the discussion on the role of ethics in banking and financial services, and to launch the latest instalment in our Future Inc. Thought Leadership Initiative, A Question of Ethics, Navigating Ethical Failure in the Banking and Financial Services Industry. Future Inc. is our platform for sharing ideas and contributing to the debate on key business and policy issues that impact our economic future. In A Question of Ethics, we examine ethical failures in banking and financial services through the lens of social psychology, in particular culture, as we believe that although essential, rules and regulations will not succeed in preventing unethical behaviour in isolation. They must be supported by an ethical culture backed by organisational leaders at all levels. A Question of Ethics is being launched around the globe in 6 countries via near simultaneous events held today and tomorrow. We kicked off earlier today in Sydney, and later tonight, dinner events follow in Hong Kong, London, and tomorrow in Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. In total, we're launching the paper to a total audience of thousands. And tonight's event is also being live streamed to additional locations across Australia and New Zealand, and webcast to many more. A very special welcome to our colleagues joining us in Perth. Welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge in attendance today our Vice President, Kevin Murphy, and one of our past presidents, Denise Boviard. Welcome. Today we're honoured to be joined by banking industry veteran and author, Dennis Jinlun. Dennis recently wrote the highly acclaimed book on ethics in organisations titled The Origins of Ethical Failures, Lessons for Leaders. Dennis will provide some introductory comments, after which I'll lead a discussion with our esteemed panel, where Dennis will be joined by Rob Everett, Chief Executive of the Financial Markets Authority, Karen Silk, GM Commercial, Corporate and Institutional at Westpac, Andy Simons, Innovation Partner, Financial Services Sector Lead at PwC, and Julie Reid, Chief Executive and Director of the Serious Fraud Office. Firstly, can I ask that you all please download the Future Inc. app on your smartphone if you haven't already done so. The instructions on how to download the app will be shown on the screen behind me. Those of you here in the room can also log in to the free Wi-Fi network for this event, and login details are also on the screen. Through the app, you can access content from today's event, network with other attendees, take notes, and participate in the live polling session at the end of today's discussion, so you too can join in the conversation. We also encourage you to share your views, questions and photos using the hashtag FutureInc via Twitter, Instagram and Flickr on the social media wall in the app. Very quickly before we start though, I do need to run through a few housekeeping notes. Evacuation or fire. On the sound of alarm, please follow instructions from the venue staff out the nearest exit and assemble in front of the ANZ Viaduct Event Centre in Karanga Plaza. Fire exits are the illuminated green signs. This is a non-smoking venue, and if you need to smoke, the smoking area is outside in the front of the building. If you do require first aid assistance, please see one of the venue staff in the first instance or visit the registration desk. Bathrooms are on each level and located near the escalators should you need them. Now to join our session, I'd like to introduce and invite to the stage Dennis Jinlun, the author of The Origins of Ethical Failures. In 2004, Dennis was publicly named as a whistleblower in the FX trading scandal that rocked the National Australia Bank, the parent company of BNZ. It was this incident that was the catalyst for his interest in human and organisational behaviour. In The Origins of Ethical Failures, Dennis combines extensive research, deep reflection, and 15 years of corporate experience to provide a comprehensive analysis of how any organisation can lose its way and engage in unconscionable conduct. More importantly, the book provides leaders with guidance on the steps they can take to not only avoid this fate, but build organisations that are more resilient to ethical failure and better placed to realise their purpose. Today, Dennis partners with leaders in organisations who understand that above all else, corporate citizenship is about making a contribution to the greater good in an ethical, sustainable and commercial way. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Dennis Jinlun.
Thank you so much, KP, and thank you for inviting me here tonight to talk on this very important topic. And as KP mentioned, my interest in this topic doesn't come from a background in academia or law, or I'm not a philosopher, but really it comes through personal experience. And I was named as a whistleblower in 2004. And in many ways, my story is quite unique because after the incident, what I chose to do was to try and put it behind me. And it wasn't necessarily because I was ashamed of being known as a whistleblower, but rather I felt I had a bigger contribution to make. And I didn't want that label to be central to who I was. I didn't want the name Dennis Jinlun to be synonymous with trading scandals and whistleblowing. So I went on to spend a further 12 years at the National Australia Bank in a variety of roles across financial markets and corporate strategy. But as anyone who's been through an experience like me will tell you, it does irrevocably shape you in some way. And what it did for me, as KP mentioned, it drove a real strong interest in human and organisational behaviour. And particularly I became very fascinated with this question as the video displayed prior to KP talking. I became fascinated with this question of why. Why do ethical failures happen and why will they continue to happen? And, the more I reflected on it, the more I realised that there's common themes underpinning all ethical failures. And, although the banking and finance industry hasn't covered itself in glory, ethical failures have hit most industries, be it drug taking in sports, or be it, engineers in the car industry installing defeat devices or journalists hacking phones. There's been very few sectors or industries that haven't been hit by ethical failure. And like I said, the more research I did, the more I realised that there were common themes underpinning all these incidents. And so what I thought I'd do for the next 10 minutes is try and explore 3 of these themes with you. And by doing that, I hope I can try and illustrate how it's really difficult to regulate for ethical conduct and really difficult for supervisors to supervise for it. And the 3 themes that I want to discuss are essentially this. Firstly, how systems can shape the character of the people within it. Secondly, how leadership can shape systems. And thirdly, how we lose sight of purpose. So the first theme is essentially this, and that is that the context within which ethical failures happen dictates the behaviour of the people within it. And that is to say, whenever we create environments where unethical behaviour becomes normalised, it's highly likely that the people within that environment will either condone or embrace the unethical conduct themselves. And this is the main point. This is the point behind systemic ethical failures, is that we are ultimately all susceptible. We like to think that our moral characters are fixed, but they're not, they're malleable. And if we get placed in environments where ethical or unethical conduct's normalised, it's highly likely that we too will be seduced and tempted. And could there be a better example of that than the revelations that came out of Wells Fargo last week? As some of you know, Wells Fargo is a US-based bank that prides itself on being a community bank rather than a Wall Street bank. And it was revealed last week that they were issuing credit cards to clients who hadn't applied for them and opening up fake bank accounts, which was causing clients to incur fees. And the regulators have handed down penalties in the vicinity of, I think, $180 million US. And Wells Fargo has actually dismissed over 5,000 people as a result of this conduct, yet despite this, the CEO and chairman, John Stumpf, says that it doesn't reflect a deeper cultural issue within the organisation. He thinks it's a result of a few bad people. I don't think so. Like I said, there are bad people out there that will do the wrong thing all of the time. Just like there are good people who will always do the right thing, but they are in the absolute minority. I refuse to accept there's 5,000 bad people operating in any organisation, let alone Wells Fargo. And a far more plausible explanation for what's happened at Wells Fargo is that a system was created which caused people within that system to behave in very uncharacteristic ways. And that's why whenever we assess ethical failures and conduct post-mortems, what's most important is that we look at the features of the system that drove the behaviour of the people within it, rather than focusing on the rogues and the bad apples within the system. So the second theme I want to talk about is how leadership shapes the system. And leaders sometimes do this in far more subtle ways than they appreciate. Because it's the people in the positions of power in the system that have the ability to create and maintain a system that promotes the unethical conduct. And we tend to spend a lot of time looking at the formal mechanisms that leaders develop and implement to talk about how they drive behaviour within the system. So by the formal mechanisms, I mean things like our compliance frameworks and our policy documents and our rules and regulations and our performance and reward schemes. And I don't want to downplay the importance of these formal mechanisms. They are important. And that was actually illustrated in the Wells Fargo incident. I think the Los Angeles attorney issued a complaint to Wells Fargo in May last year. And amongst other things, the complaint said the following, that Wells Fargo has an ambitious and strictly enforced sales quota system that predictably and naturally drives its bankers to engage in fraudulent behaviour to meet unreachable goals. So clearly there was a system in place, a formal system, which promoted, some of this conduct. So I'm not trying to downplay the importance of formal systems, but what my experience shows me is that far more important than these formal systems are the informal systems. And the informal systems are the messages that leaders and the people in the positions of power in a system send through their actions and their choices and their decisions. Because everything that leaders do sends a signal. Action sends signals, omission sends signals, everything does. And these signals tell employees what the organisation really values and what people need to do to get ahead. So in the aftermath of ethical failures like the one at Wells Fargo, I think these are the more important questions to ask. Firstly, did the leaders dismiss anyone for not hitting their sales targets? Also, who did the leaders reward, promote and hold out to be champions of the business? Were they the ethical role models, or were they the people that consistently hit their sales target by possibly, using dubious means? And also, was there information that leaders had access to which suggested that potentially something was amiss? And by failing to act on that information, they sent a message that the wrongdoing was acceptable. Or worse still, were there leaders who engaged in the wrongdoing, thus sending a message that it was, explicitly condoned? These are the defining moments in an organisation. These are really the moments that matter. It's these types of moments that create a system that dictates the conduct of the people within it. Because, we always work in organisations where we have goals and targets, but it's the choices and the decisions and the actions of leaders that will determine whether someone can honestly fall short of a target and use it as a learning experience, or feel as if they have to embrace any means justifies the ends attitude and do whatever it takes to reach their target. And the final theme that I want to speak about tonight that underpins the majority of ethical failures is that organisations, and in some cases entire industries, lose sight of purpose. And this is particularly relevant to the banking and finance industry. Because in certain pockets of the industry, we lost sight of our moral obligations. Instead of joining the industry to give of themselves and contribute to customer and community, people joined the industry to give to themselves. Money and money making was given precedence over making a contribution to the greater good. And it's a position, I think, that was really well articulated by Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England, when in a speech he delivered in 2014, he said the following. He said, "In the run-up to the global financial crisis, banking became about banks, not businesses, transactions, not relations, counterparties, not clients. New instruments originally designed to meet the credit and hedging needs of businesses quickly morphed into ways to amplify bets on financial outcomes. When bankers become detached from end users, their only reward becomes money. Purely financial compensation ignores the non-pecuniary rewards to employment, such as the satisfaction from helping a client or colleague succeed." And this, for me, represents one of the key challenges facing the banking and finance industry right now. it needs to reorientate itself so that service to other and its social purpose takes precedence over service to self. And let me be clear, there are areas in the banking and finance industry where this orientation already exists. There are many good people in the industry doing honourable work, and I know some of them. But in some pockets of the industry, there is still a lot of work to do. And like all change, this won't be straightforward. It'll take a lot of time, but most importantly, it'll take strong leadership. And it definitely starts with boards and executives, but leaders at all levels of the industry play a role. Leaders must, through both their actions and their words, demonstrate a deep commitment to their social purpose and place their principles ahead of their privileges. And they must address formal mechanisms that compromise their values and their purpose. And there's no code of conduct or no policy document or no compliance framework that can help you do this type of work. There's no regulator out there that can regulate for this type of work. It's change that must be wholeheartedly embraced and driven by the leaders within the industry. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dennis. Now welcome to the stage our panel for our panel discussion. So joining us on the stage, in addition to Dennis Jinlun, who we've previously introduced and you've just heard from, we also have Rob Everett, Chief Executive of the Financial Markets Authority. We have Karen Silk, GM Commercial, Corporate and Institutional at Westpac. Andy Simons, Innovation Partner and Financial Services Lead at PwC. And Julie Reid, Chief Executive and Director of the Serious Fraud Office. So welcome everyone, welcome.
Thank
you. So I'd like to invite you all to introduce yourselves a little bit more and also provide us with some opening remarks to help frame up the discussion for our panel start tonight. Julie, you are on my right, so I'm going to start with you first.
Thanks, Karen. So, as Karen mentioned, I'm currently the Chief Executive and Director of the Serious Fraud Office of New Zealand. Prior to that, I spent about 11 or 12 years with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. So I had an indirect relationship with Dennis while I was there. I worked for enforcement at ASIC, and ASIC was the organisation which ultimately investigated the traders that, in relation to whom Dennis was the whistleblower. Prior to that, I was a federal prosecutor in Australia, and my main interest there was also financial crime and fraud. So that's been my interest for the entirety of my professional career. In terms of this general question, I think it's a really fascinating one. As a prosecutor for a long time and indirectly involved in prosecuting ever since, I was always really intrigued to find that defendants who had plainly broken the law, done the wrong thing ethically and legally, still believed that what they did was okay, that they were really acting in someone else's best interests. And I've often come across circumstances of the kind that Dennis talked about, where whole organisations were involved in conduct which was plainly illegal, and it was part of the culture of those organisations. So I find the whole subject of ethics and how you change the culture of organisations really interesting.
Great, thank you, Julie. Andy.
KP. So I'm Andy. I am the Innovation and Financial Services Sector Lead at PwC. For 4 years I was the leader of the retail bank at the BNZ, and so lived and breathed leading a large, complex, people-based organisation spread across a large geography, and particularly with an eye on what was happening in the UK and in other parts of the world. Went to sleep at night worrying about leadership, ethics, the the right people behaviours inside of that organisation. In particular, how you got the right balance of having a motivated, energised and focused group of people out there wanting to do the right thing in the community, but then growing the right culture, to Dennis's point, internally, that meant that you could be comfortable and confident that when you did get into grey areas of interactions with people, the right things were happening. The other thing that fascinated me during that time was the increasing role that technology was playing, and in fact the increasing tension that can put into an organisation as customers themselves begin to make choices about how they're going to interact with the financial services system. In my role at PwC, I have particular interest in the increasing role of technology moving forward and what that's going to mean for understanding consumer behaviour, the role that data is going to play in financial services moving forward. In particular, watching with one eye as technology such as robo-advice become a bigger piece of financial services moving forward, and expecting to see in the near future consumers needing to take more accountability for their own data, even inside financial institutions, what happens to that data and how they are actually comfortable with that data being used.
It'll be good to explore that a little more as we move into the panel discussion, and the threats around big data and the opportunities for some ethical failures around that have been identified clearly through the report. So it's an area we all need to be really conscious of, so appreciate your view on that. Thank you. Karen.
So good afternoon. My name's Karen Silk, and I am General Manager of Commercial, Corporate and Institutional here at Westpac in New Zealand. I've been a banker for over 25 years, and largely in institutional banking and a little bit in mid-markets as well, and leading teams both here and in Australia, so I've worked in both markets. It is a very interesting topic and a very relevant topic. If you want to build a successful and sustainable business, then the culture of your organisation and the ethics or values are fundamental to ensuring that occurs. As we were talking about before, and as Dennis raised, it's not easy to do that. Particularly when you are running a large workforce that is geographically distributed, how do you embed the same kind of beliefs and attitudes to ensure that you're getting consistency in terms of the behaviour and that it's appropriate behaviour? And we firmly believe that it's not just what I would call the skeleton that you create, which is around your processes and policies and whether you've got the right code of conduct and what KPIs you set and how you assess performance, but it's actually how do you support that skeleton? Okay, so how do you support that skeleton with the right kind of muscle, if we can call it that, that will support that framework? And really that comes back to how do you create an operating rhythm that embeds those values at the heart of how people behave every day, and it's the start of the decision making, not unintended consequences of the decision making. And how do you create the right leadership through all levels of the organisation, and not just voices from the top, but how do you engage and get the right leadership across your organisation to support the frameworks that you have when it comes to thinking about embedding values in your business.
Great, thank you. Leadership's come through very clearly as being the most important aspect in terms of helping build that cultural piece. So it'll be good to have that debate about how do we actually demonstrate that. What does that look like? Yeah, great. Welcome.
Good evening, thanks KP. Rob Everett, I'm the Chief Executive of the Financial Markets Authority. I spent most of my career as a securities lawyer, either in private practice or in-house around the world. I spent 20 years in a single financial institution, which I think it's fair to say morphed quite considerably during the period I was there, and I've seen close up some of the impacts of both good and bad leadership. So in some ways, it's slightly ironic that I find myself in New Zealand as the head of the conduct regulator, particularly given, I think, through the financial crisis itself and the immediate aftermath. That is assuming there has been an aftermath, and I think we might still be in it. But anyway, topic for another night maybe. A lot of focus on prudential risks, a lot of focus on risk management, focus on safety and soundness of financial institutions, particularly systemic ones, and the impact that has on the economy. And really only later did the whole issue of conduct risk and the regulation of conduct really emerge as a really key component of the response to the financial crisis and some of the issues around that. So it's an interesting vantage point for me now as a conduct regulator, asking ourselves, where do we fit in this picture? What can we change? What can we influence? What can we make happen, if anything? And I think I say to a lot of people, I think I'd have been a much better investment banking lawyer if I'd had kids a lot earlier, because I realised that actually it's about human behaviour. You might have very bright, very driven, very well-paid people, but actually people are the same, whatever age and wherever they are. And Dennis made the point in his intro, a lot of this is about learned behaviour. Right? And I can't be clearer, really, in my mind, that it's the modelling of behaviours. You can write what you want in the regulations. You can have someone like me, espouse it from the pulpit. You can chisel it on the walls. You can put it on your tea coasters. You can do what you like, but actually the way people learn is the same way that children learn. They look at the people they admire or they think they're supposed to admire, and they learn those behaviours. So if within an institution, the leaders, which are not always in everyone's minds the people at the very top of the institution, if those people say one thing and do something else, then you can forget the regulations, you can forget your code of conduct, you can forget the ethical training. Actually, you are sinking below the waterline. And so for me, this is a very interesting topic, because clearly as the conduct regulator, I have to believe there's something we can contribute to good conduct in financial services. If you look back over the last 5-10 years, I think financial services probably does stand out as an industry where ethics and conduct have let it down. I think I saw a survey in the US recently that said that financial services was the least trusted industry of all the ones they surveyed, which, with all due respect to any real estate agents present, ought to be pretty shocking. So I think for us at the FMA, it's how we can help the providers of financial services, how we can help the advisors of financial services, how we can help customers, investors, everyone who's in that mix work out how to do this better, because it is hard to see how we could do it worse.
That's great, thanks Rob. So Dennis, in the opening introduction of the report, there's a quote by the Brazilian anthropologist Valdemar Setzer, and the quote is, "Ethics is not definable, is not implementable, because it's not conscious. It involves not only our thinking, but also our feeling." So for me, that raises this question: can ethics be taught?
It's a very good question. I think, so traditionally, the way we've taught ethics has worked on this assumption that we're all rational people. And, we think that, so what we do is we bring people into a classroom, we give them these very difficult ethical dilemmas, and they sit there and they brainstorm them. And those dilemmas, those really excruciating right versus right dilemmas, where two well-meaning people can come up with different conclusions. And we think, though, that by taking people through these dilemmas, they'll be better equipped when they get into the workplace to deal with them. But we're not rational people. We actually we behave on our intuitions. So if you put us in an environment where, the norms suggest that unethical behaviour is condoned, where leaders are role modelling the wrong behaviour, where the incentive scheme promotes you, if you do the wrong behaviour, then our intuitions will take over our rational thinking, and we're more likely than not behave in an unethical way. So how do you teach ethics? Well, I think we've got to realise that in the workplace, ethics is messy. It's not clean. It involves interpersonal relationships where you have to challenge people when they're doing the wrong thing. So one of the leaders, I think, in ethics education is a woman called Mary Gentile, who's based in the University of Virginia in the US. And she's developed a curriculum called Giving Voice to Values, where when you go into the classroom, you go through case studies which people have actually confronted, and you put yourself in the position of the protagonist, and you have to think about, okay, what do I actually do? And you have to articulate who you're going to approach, what you're going to say, script your response, actually, practice your response. The thinking being a bit like public speaking, you can sort of exercise your moral muscle so that when you face that really excruciating situation in the workplace where you have to confront someone because you're seeing something that's not quite right, you perhaps will be better equipped to do that. Now, Mary will admit that, it's not perfect, it's not foolproof, but I think that's a step in the right direction where, ethics, like I said, it's messy, it requires moral courage, and if moral courage is what's required in the workplace, we have to equip people with moral courage in the classroom. So in addition to challenging people intellectually, we also have to challenge them emotionally and spiritually.
So open to the panel, how do we actually help teach this at work? So using that context, how do we actually bring this into the workplace to teach new people coming in what the ethical standard is?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So we wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying, and so one of the things that we've done in more recent times is roll out a program that has just become part of the daily operating rhythm within our business, and it's embedded in what is the service promise as an organisation. So, which is really all about delivering superior service, understanding the customer and creating the right solution for them that fits their needs. And at the same time, having a people promise embedded in this as well, which is really about how do we train and teach our people the right way to do this. So not just outcome, but how do you do it? But to reinforce that, what we actually do is our teams get together 2 to 3 times a week, and the service promise is dissected down into 12 steps. And what they do is they pick one of those steps, and then they have to start telling stories which celebrate and recognise when that right behaviour has actually been occurring. And then those stories are then shared across an internal social media tool so that it can be shared right across the whole distributed workforce. Now, what that is starting to do is it's changing the conversation. And the conversation and the decision making is now starting with what is the customer experience you're trying to create, and then work backwards from there. Don't start with what is the legal rule I'm trying to meet or adhere to, and then the customer experience becomes an unintended consequence of it. So it's completely reversing the way we build and make decisions within the business.
I think one feature I've seen, which is an interesting reflection on that, is that most people who join certainly financial institutions, professional services firms, haven't joined them with the intent to do wrong. I mean, quite frankly, at this point, the last place you'd go if you intended to do wrong was probably a financial institution. So something is happening within those institutions where, I mean, you can use the bad apple terminology, good people turn bad, or good people, or people who think they're good end up doing things that in hindsight look really bad. So I think in any industry, particularly those that harbour really big institutions, that's the challenge, to work out what are the incremental things that happened in that building that allowed someone to convince themselves that they can look themselves in the mirror every morning and that they're a good person, and that yet when it hits the headlines, when it hits the TV news, everyone's looking at them saying, how could you possibly have thought that was okay? And we were talking beforehand, and Julie was sharing some experiences from having looked at this in Australia. A real feature of the worlds that Julie and I inhabit is a lot of people who this audience would pretty much universally agree have done something really unpleasant and inappropriate, actually themselves don't believe that. And so there's a real gap in people's thinking about how I've behaved, which is based on what they've seen around them, it's based on what they've seen rewarded, it's based on what they've been allowed to do with no one stepping in, that has led to them, moving their behaviour to somewhere they would never have envisaged on day one.
It's interesting because in the report, there was a survey of financial services professionals in the USA and the UK. 47% believed their competitors had engaged in unethical or illegal conduct to get ahead, yet only 23% believed the same of their colleagues. So this effect was also evident in the research we did in the survey. Respondents consistently thought that ethically questionable practices were more prevalent in a country sense at large than in their own companies. Yeah. So if we can't recognise it in ourselves and our colleagues and our workplaces, how are we going to prevent it and fix it?
I think the part of it is about being really explicit about what is not ethical, because I agree with Dennis, but I think that while you can train people in schools and so on, that the pervading culture of an organisation can wipe that out, as Rob was just saying. So if everyone in an organisation does something which is unethical, it will very quickly cease to have any effect or any impact in their minds as being unethical. And I think you have to be, in addition, and no doubt the banks are being now, in addition to the approach that Karen was talking about, people are saying it's not acceptable to do these things. And I think unless you're really expressed, people can't necessarily make the connection between the theoretical and what they're doing every day in their jobs. So I think that we have to start looking at that as well.
And just picking up on that, I think from my own experience and agreeing with you both, for leaders in banks or any professional organisation, it's more than just saying we're going to be ethical, we're going to do the right thing by the customer. I think we all have to be very mindful and self-aware. We have to demonstrate the thought process we are going through when we're making a tough or impactful decision, to give people a framework that they can then pick up and run with, and to continue to role model that behaviour. And I reckon you have to do it a dozen times before the people around you begin to really understand how you think, how you apply the principles and morals that we've all agreed to, and start to use it themselves.
So the point about what is ethical is an interesting one to discuss, because the parliamentary committee that investigated the finance company collapses here in New Zealand described the financial community leading up to that collapse as a culture in which anything that was not illegal was right. So is that right? If it's not illegal, is it ethical?
I think that's a really good question to pose at the broader financial services arena, by which I include the lawyers and the accountants and the tax advisors who advise that industry. Because if there's an industry where fantastic talent was put to use to find innovative ways around the rules, it was financial services, and probably in places still is. And that culture that says, we know what the rules say, and this, by the way, is why regulating culture and conduct is so difficult to pull off, is that we know what the rules say, but actually because it's worded this way, we've got a legal opinion or a tax opinion, or we're comfortable that if we do it that way, technically we're not in breach, and we're all okay with that. And again, that's incremental over time. The bank next door did it, the bank over there did it, everyone else is doing it, we're not. Why is that? And then actually that creates a pervasive sense that the rules are there really to be gamed. And once you're in that territory, I think all is lost, to be perfectly honest. And if you look at a lot of what went on in the run-up to the crisis, it was gaming the capital rules, it was gaming the liquidity rules, it was gaming the risk management rules. And that wasn't just people in the banks, that was the entire sector and all of those who advise it. And, that didn't end well.
I think that's the answer to the question, is if it's not illegal, is it ethical? Well, who thinks the GFC was ethical? I think there'd be very few people who would say, yes, that was an ethical event. So that answers the question. I think it's a lot deeper than doing the right thing by the legal standards.
And I think that the international response to corruption is demonstrating that it's becoming unacceptable, both to governments and communities. And, corruption is a fairly substantial instance of unethical behaviour. And I think that it will become unacceptable whether it's legal or not. I think that unethical behaviour is becoming unacceptable to society at large.
As an analogy, I'm off trail here, but as an analogy, I look at other industries, like the food industry, and I reflect on the increasing emphasis and visibility and transparency that food producers are being required to put around the products and offerings that they provide. And I find myself reflecting on financial institutions what if the same level of transparency around the ingredients into their products and services were required? How would that make the end user, the customer, actually feel about that product or service? And I think it's useful sometimes to think outside of the industry for analogy.
Yeah, interesting. So that kind of leads to this bad apples or bad apple trees debate. So is it bad apples, or is it the apple tree or the orchard in which they're growing? So what's your thoughts on apples in the barrel?
But
Apples get a bad rap, don't they?
Yeah.
They get a very bad rap. Bad eggs. Should we use eggs?
Yeah. I mean, I think I made my view pretty clear during my speech, and there will be instances, KP, where you do get bad people who go rogue, and that will happen. So, let's be frank, no organisation or institution is perfect, and we will always expect that there will be people who go rogue, so to speak. But when you get, systemic issues, so I've got to be careful when I say this, because some bankers get very irate at me when I say the issues are systemic. So I don't mean that the entire system is broken. Like I said, there are some very, very honourable people doing great work in the industry, but the issues are systemic because if you look at rate rigging, or if you look at poor financial advice, they're not just occurring in one institution, they're occurring across the industry, which means that we've created a system which promotes this sort of conduct. And that comes back to the things, that I've spoken about before. It's about, the things that leaders are role modelling, the decisions they're making around the formal mechanisms they're putting in place. People are incentivised to do the wrong thing. And this is why the topic's so fascinating, right? This is where it comes back to the apple barrel and culture, and how do we address that and try and get that right?
I think it brings the topic of diversity up as well, because you need to create an environment where it's okay to challenge, and it's okay to challenge groupthink, and what you might perceive as right or wrong norms within the organisation. And you don't get that when everyone is the same, looks the same, thinks the same, and acts the same. So encouraging diversity in your workforce, and diversity really in the way you think, is absolutely fundamental to getting this right.
So diversity is a fascinating one, because I agree with that, but if you don't have a dynamic that allows that diversity to express itself, you've got issues. So, there's a lady I met in a recent visit to the US called Professor Amy Edmondson from Harvard University, and she's come up with this concept of psychological safety. She actually started doing her research in hospital settings where you have a team of practitioners that come together, and although there's not a formal hierarchy, there's an informal hierarchy, because the doctors tend to be the more dominant people and the more powerful people in that group. And this concept of psychological safety is where people feel that they can and should speak up when something's not right. And what they found was that the incidence of medicines being incorrectly administered to patients diminished when there was greater psychological safety in that group. But you can have diversity, but still have two powerful figures in a group that shuts down, the benefits that diversity offers, and that's this concept of psychological safety. And an easy way of measuring that is when you look at a group, are there one or two individuals who dominate conversations? Is there one person when they say something, everyone just shuts up and agrees with them? They're just little things you should look out for in the workplace, because if you're in a group like that, it suggests that people have got thoughts and feelings that they're not sharing with the group. And not only is that bad for the ethics of an organisation, it's bad for performance, because some of those ideas might actually result in, increased customer satisfaction or revenue, etc.
I feel an acronym coming on here, because I think it's about diversity, to your point, the dynamic, but then also the principles. So have diversity, but some principles and a framework to focus that diversity on, and away you go.
Yeah, there's an interesting book called The Loudest Duck, and it talks about trying to manage diversity in the workplace, and it works on the theory that in our European culture the squeaky wheel gets the oil, but that in the Asian culture the loudest duck gets shot. So how do you incorporate all of the different diversity aspects into the community? And it makes an interesting quote that we recruit for diversity, but we end up firing people because they don't fit in culturally.
A colleague of mine in the US, actually, on the Wells Fargo thing, says that this is a really big incident, and one of the reasons is if you look at their board, it's quite a diverse board, and they pride themselves on that.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, you've got the CE basically saying this is bad apples, and you've got 5,000 bad apples, and that's assuming, of course, they've fired everyone who was either involved or aware of it and walked past it and let it happen. So my guess is you're probably looking at 20,000 people, not 5,000 people. So I don't think an industry can really use the bad apples analogy when you've got that number of people, or again, your other point, you've got repeated instances across institutions, across jurisdictions. So one of the things we look at here in New Zealand, when people say, well, that's a year, so we're all good, right? The answer will be, to go back to what I said earlier, human behaviour is largely the same wherever you go. So the things that lead people down this path, the same levers tend to have the same effect. So, obviously what you've got to try and do is get to those levers early and pull the ones that create an ethical environment where people can challenge each other and people can point out things that are wrong. Because actually, generally speaking, once you socialise the challenge that you've got ethically with something that's happening in an institution, generally those things stop happening. But in a lot of these instances, people probably didn't feel they could challenge, and so they just shut their minds to it.
Yeah.
Things like that.
It's a big speak-up cultures is a big issue that is one way that you can create a more ethical culture where you create environments where people feel that they can and should speak up, and when they do, they're respected and listened to, and their concerns, are appropriately addressed. And I often say to directors when I speak to them, there's information about your organisation which you can't have out in the public domain because, there's confidentiality requirements, etc. But there's information you've got which could be out in the public domain, and if it was, you'd feel very uncomfortable. That's what you've got to get comfortable with, because ultimately, if you look at people who speak up or whistleblowers, ultimately what they're doing is creating transparency. And when you get comfortable with transparency as a director, you say, I've got nothing to hide, I'm prepared to put it all out there. That's when you're comfortable with a speak-up culture as well, because you're prepared to people, you're happy for people to lift the lid on things and expose things that might make you feel a bit uncomfortable.
And the bottom line is that if you do that, your business will profit far more than it will profit if it tries to cover up the whistleblower's information. And we see that in Security and Note Printing Australia, where they had a whistleblower, he was ignored, vilified, pushed out, and eventually they ended up not making an announcement themselves about something that they had addressed, but on the front page of the Financial Times in Australia, and then the companies became the ones who were vilified, and it's such an unprofitable way to proceed.
I think if you look at all these ethical failures, because whistleblower unfortunately is a term that people don't feel comfortable with, but I always say there's numerous whistleblowing moments leading up to it where someone has approached someone within your organisation and said, I don't feel comfortable with this, but they haven't been listened to. And that's where you end up, the whole slippery slope thing, and then you end up having the whistleblower having to lift the lid on the big scandal. And my experience was no different to that. Like, unbeknown to me, it came out in the final report, but there were numerous people, both within and outside the organisation, who expressed concerns, but nothing was done.
So back to this bad apples, Julie, you're dealing with some bad apples in terms of some of the stuff that you're doing. What, bad apples or bad orchards? What are you saying?
Well, personally, I think it's bad orchards. I think one of the most instructive cases that I've done in my career was one where customs officers were accepting stale cigarettes. So stale cigarettes are returned to customs in Australia and they're destroyed in return for a refund of the excise duty. In Tasmania, where I come from, I think just about every customs officer was accepting stale cigarettes. I've never been a smoker, but it doesn't sound attractive to me. Nonetheless, they were all accepting stale cigarettes right up to the deputy controller, so the person in charge of customs in Tasmania. And this went on for years. And, customs is a career service, so you come in when you're 16 and you're told, part of this job here is that once a month when they destroy the cigarettes, you get a few packets of stale cigarettes. And so nobody ever questions that. And it just goes on. And even after this was discovered, because the person destroying the cigarettes took the opportunity to steal a few fresh ones as well, even when this was discovered, the whole of the customs office in Tasmania went through 2 years of utter hell. So they had a huge internal investigation, they had a police investigation, and a whole lot of people were prosecuted, a whole lot of people went through disciplinary proceedings. And at the end of it, after 2 years, where every relationship in the whole place must have been tested, everyone had been through the ringer, we had the last disciplinary proceeding. And one of the members of the panel asked a witness from Customs, having been through all of this, did she now think that it was wrong to take the stale cigarettes? And she said no. So that was the culture of the place, you know, and that's an extreme example where you've got people who come in and they just grow up in this culture. But I can't believe personally, but obviously it happened, that you could go through all of that and still think that it was okay. And that's a cultural issue. I just think that it's what's tolerated and what's promoted.
Yeah, policies aren't going to deal with that, are they?
It's instructive too that the next thing was stealing the fresh cigarettes, or such a thing.
Yeah.
So again, shades of grey, right? You know, once you're on that path, it's quite difficult to then draw the distinction with the next piece of activity that only feels slightly different, but actually probably crosses a line that even other people would have drawn.
Interesting. Andy, let's bring back to this data and technology piece. You know, so it's, you know, a huge risk potentially in this sector now, the access to big data and how much information we know about our customers. But what role can technology, you know, play in helping shape ethical outcomes and behaviours within business? What sort of trends are you seeing?
Look, I think there's a couple of ways of thinking about this. For financial services institutions, you know, I find myself talking to people a lot about the role that data and analytics should be playing in looking at patterns, looking at predicting adverse behaviour, and then looking at it also in the role that technology is playing in changing the way customers interact, consumers interact, business customers or mum and dad, you know, people on the street customers interact with financial services organisations. The reality is that all of this technology is leading us towards a world where things are going to be more transparent, consumers have more control, they have options, and I think it's really interesting to observe that some of the fintech disruptors that we're seeing coming into the market, you know, the approach that they're taking, which is meaning that they're getting noticed and that they're growing their business rapidly, is that they start out solving customer problems. They focus on a customer problem, they go to solve it, they solve it well, giving the customer control, transparency and optionality. So I think, you know, the faster big FS players can accelerate to making those some of their principles, as opposed to how can we tack on another product and then sell a lot of them to keep our revenues going. You know, it's about really flipping the whole mindset on its head. Yep. And look, to be fair, I see some great progress being made in that in New Zealand. It's complex, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's critical to our financial services industry maintaining credibility and to be frank, maintaining relevance to the customer moving forward.
Yeah, I like the comment you made there, Andy, about you know, the disruptors and the ones that tend to be successful, the ones that are driven by some sort of purpose in terms of, I want to, you know, solve a customer problem. And I think that's what you find in that fintech space and more broadly in that you know, whole disruptor space, that there are people who are jumping in there now because they see it as the next growth part of the economy, and they're in there not driven by a higher purpose but more driven by selfish reasons because I want to get, you know, rich quickly. And they're the ones that tend to run into ethical issues because they're not driven by a high purpose. And that's a comment I made at the end of my speech. I think that's a challenge for all big organisations these days, that, you know, a lot of people think that capitalism is broken, and I don't necessarily think that's the case. I love the story that I got told by a guy out of New York who's a professor for ethical leadership at NYU, and when he got to New York was when the Occupy Wall Street movement was happening. And at the time, he had a lot of sympathy for them, you know, those capitalist pigs, you know, post-GFC, they're getting big bonuses. But then he said when you do your research and you look at poverty levels across the world, they're at all-time lows. So obviously capitalism, you know, has some good to offer. And he thinks that the way that we can really get the best out of capitalism is if organisations are guided by a higher social purpose and do that in a commercial way. When you start putting, you know, shareholder above everything else, and in the GFC it actually went beyond that. I think the bank managers put themselves above the shareholder because I think there were some banks paying out more in bonuses and dividends. That's when you start having issues. But if we can have organisations, like I say, articulate a higher purpose and bring, you know, their people along on the journey, I think that's when we'll see the best of what capitalism's got to offer.
So these are telling times for some of our technology disruptors, you know, the Googles, the Facebooks, the PayPals. You know, will they hold true to some of those principles that saw them become successful to begin with?
Do no evil.
Yeah.
Entirely sure that's panned out.
You know, it's an interesting challenge, and I guess it's one of those issues in terms of the euphemisms we face too, in terms of tax efficiency. Interesting challenge. But I mean, that kind of leads to the role of regulators, you know, because, you know, we have a legal obligation as directors to the shareholders, and we have to focus on that responsibility. What role as regulators can you play in helping influence culture? Can you?
Well, I have to believe there's a role because I'm running a conduct regulator, so I don't want to do myself out of a job. I mean, there's clearly a role for the regulator. I mean, you can set some boundaries, you can provide some clarity, particularly in areas that are complicated. You can send some messages with enforcement. So there's clearly a role, but at the end of the day, it's just not enough. And actually, the core thing is the thing we were talking about earlier, which is whether it's from a sense of purpose, whether it's from a clear sort of cultural identity within industries and within organisations. The regulators can only do so much, and you really can't regulate a sector into a good culture. You can help it confront what a bad culture looks like. You can help it assess what sort of indicators might tell you there's something wrong. But at the end of the day, that change has to be within the industry and the organisations in it, and then that goes back to the people leading and the people setting the examples and giving the rewards and the punishments. So, yes, the regulator can have an impact, but we can't overestimate that impact. The regulator could do the best job possible, but it could still fail if the industry and the people who lead it don't really believe they need to change.
And I think they've done a good job in terms of, I think regulators have probably done a lot of the heavy lifting that leaders have failed to do in a lot of respects. So if you look at, returns and wages in financial services, they're coming under pressure. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because there was a lot of privilege and entitlement in that system that needed to be flushed out. And through, some of the measures that regulators have taken, they've helped do that. But I think in the conversations I've had, regulators are starting to realise that, conversations with the board and executive is just not enough. And I think the Dutch Central Bank, actually, the model that they've embraced is they actually do on-site visits where they try and have, interviews with people deep in the organisation and try and flush out what are the stories that they're telling, what is the behaviour they're observing, because that's the only way you'll actually understand what's happening in an organisation. Because, typically what happens in most large organisations is the board and executive will say, ethics is central to everything we do, and they absolutely mean it sincerely. And it's only when you get to the lower levels that people start saying, well, ethics is a bit of a moving target for us.
The report talks about ethical moments, and you've used the term previously in terms of connecting those to how we perhaps might approach health and safety, and health and safety
Yes.
moments in terms of what we say and what we do. How do we get more emphasis on those ethical moments in our businesses?
Yeah, and I think the story I used in an address I delivered to a function similar to this in Canberra was the one of Paul Anderson, who's the ex-CEO of BHP. I think he became CEO in 1998, and they had this big focus on safety. And there's a lot of parallels, I think, between the journey the mining industry went on with safety and the journey the banking and finance industry is going on. I think probably one of the big differences is you can measure improvements in safety. There's actual data there around, number of days lost due to injuries. But Paul Anderson came on board and had a big focus on safety. Invested a lot in training programs. He had it written up in the company's charter. He communicated frequently to his people about the importance of safety. Yet 2 years after being CEO, he could not improve the company's safety record. And so he dragged in the head of safety into his office and asked, what's going on? Why can't we do this? And to his credit, the head of safety said, well, it's actually your fault, Paul. And Paul said, what do you mean it's my fault? And the head of safety started explaining to him that, you ride your Harley Davidson without a helmet. The speed limit in the car park's 5 kilometres per hour. Everyone knows your car and they know you drive faster. When you go to plants, you don't follow the safety rules like wearing a helmet and holding onto the handrails. Now, Paul Anderson, people who speak about him say he's a highly ethical man, but these small, seemingly inconsequential actions were sending a very loud message to his organisation about what's really important and what they really valued. And these are the defining moments. And so what that story illustrates is that even very ethical leaders can fall short. This is the point, where we are all fallible. And we're going to be humble enough to recognise that. But that also means that we have to surround ourselves by a group of people where we create that sense of psychological safety, where we do fall short and we are sending the wrong messages, we trust them that they will call us out and hold us accountable so that we can address, our conduct that's sending the wrong message.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's just within an organisation though. If you think about the relationship that you have, a bank has with a regulator, you've got to get to a point where there's some trust. And if you think about ethical moments, it's about regulator, the bank itself trusting that if an error is made, they can be very transparent and own up to it, and with the right remediation plan,
Yes.
ensure that recovery happens. And we I'm happy to talk about it because it's very public. We had a situation a few months ago where an external customer raised a point with us around fees that we were charging for people taking cash out of Australian ATMs. And when we reviewed that situation, we looked at it and went, actually the wrong base rate has been applied. And it's not just been for a short period of time, it's actually been for a number of years. We have, we work hard to have a good relationship with the regulator. So what we did was actually go back, do all the work, discover every customer that had been in that situation, turn up to the regulator, be very transparent about the issue that was there, but actually here's the remediation, and this is how we're going to refund everybody. Yeah. And actually this is the changes that we're going to make to new product development and the life cycle that you test through that to ensure that actually these things don't happen again.
Yeah, I do agree. And we do need to, this is a really complex, difficult issue, and we do need to be collaborative in how we go about it. And I think the us versus them mentality between, private institutions and regulators doesn't help.
No.
But there is also, what we've got to keep in mind is it does need to be a degree of tension there as well. So it's a fascinating relationship.
It's a healthy tension.
Exactly right. Yeah.
That has to exist.
Yes.
It kins nicely with audit, doesn't it? A healthy tension. So on that point of transparency, in a recent survey of financial services employees in the USA and the UK, almost a quarter of respondents believed that unethical practices were widespread in their company. So a quarter. That was up from only 12% 3 years prior. Are we more unethical or are we more aware? Why the uplift, do you think?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, let's be frank. So ethics is on the radar now like it never has been before. Yeah. So there could be some truth in what you said, that because we are more aware, that it appears that there's more unethical behaviour. Like, I reflect on my time, and there were things going on which were quite acceptable when I joined financial markets as a graduate back in the year 2000. Which now would be considered totally abhorrent, and rightly so. Don't get me wrong. I think the shift's been the right one. So potentially there's, I think something in that.
Yeah, hard to know the answer, but I would be inclined to think that two things have happened. One is even people within the industry trust it less to be delivering, good outcomes for customers and markets and the rest of it. So probably they're more inclined now to believe that there may be things that are inappropriate. And also, the goalposts may have shifted a bit in the right direction, so that things that they would have tolerated 3 or 4 years ago, they're now looking at and thinking, maybe that thing I've heard about but never seen actually does mean there's something wrong, whereas 3 years ago they would have said, either I don't believe it, or actually that's fine. I think it has shifted.
I'm with you. I'd like to think that people are thinking a bit more broadly about the world, the climate, all sorts of things, including what's right and wrong in the business world, including what's right and wrong in financial services.
Yeah, I will say, however, my experience in investment banking tells me that memories are incredibly short. And 3 years is about as long, certainly in the institution I was in, for, people move on, turnover happens, new people come in, things get diluted. So whilst I suspect we're still in the period where people are paying attention and treating things differently, again, as a regulator and as an industry, you cannot be complacent because the cycles are ever shorter, and the people in the industry are getting ever younger. And so the people who've been through several cycles, who may have seen this coming once or twice before, whether it's a credit cycle or a market risk cycle or whatever it is, a conduct risk cycle, in a lot of financial institutions and in financial services, those people are no longer in the industry. And so there's a real risk of people being surprised by things that, once they've been in the industry 25 years, comes as no surprise to them. And I certainly saw that, at the institution I was at. So I'd like to think people's attention is more focused on this, but I'm also convinced that if people don't keep hammering at this topic, that it will return to what we've seen in the past much quicker than people would like.
It's a good note for us to then pass over to you to get you involved in this conversation. So to do that, we'd firstly like you to participate in a poll using the app. So if I could ask for those of you who have had the chance to download the app on your phone to open that up and locate the live poll icon in the app. We're going to ask you a series of 3 questions. And we'll give you a moment or so, a minute or so, to be able to complete that. So I'll leave you to the live poll. Very foreboding, wasn't it, just as it counted down? Just while those are being collated. The first question for the audience was, how important is regulation in shaping ethical outcomes? And the 3 options were very important or essential, moderately important but must be combined with other measures, not that important. What's your take on where the audience is going to sit?
Did we need to tell them that it's anonymous or not?
Big data, nothing's ever anonymous.
Well, for me, it clearly is important, but it's not the whole game. So I think it's the answer that points to a blend of what the regulator can do, but what the industry needs to do itself.
Oh, great. Well, let's see the outcome of question number 1. How important is regulation in shaping ethical outcomes? 38% agree it's very important or essential. 61% moderately important but must be combined with other measures. 1% not that important.
I didn't have my phone on me.
So here's stand up.
A couple of FMA staff in the audience perhaps who So probably not a surprise in terms of where that split has been given our conversation and the balance between the two. I mean, are you comfortable with where that kind of balance sits?
Yeah, and also in the way the question's phrased, it doesn't mean that the 38% who said it was very important didn't also think it needed to be combined. So I think when you add those 2 together, I think that has to be the right result.
Yeah. Great. So moving to question 2. Have you witnessed unethical behaviour in your organisation? Yes or no? 57% for yes indicated that they've seen unethical behaviour in the organisation, and only 43% no. Are we surprised at those results?
No, not really. I mean, I think a great follow-up question there would have been of those who said yes, did they do anything about it? Yeah, and that's and once I don't say that in a way that reflects on them as an individual. I'm saying what's the environment like at that workplace? Whether can they speak up and challenge it?
What an incredible challenge that is, though, for institutions, employers.
Yeah.
You've got more than half of an audience basically don't like some of the things they've seen. I mean, that tells you how prevalent that sense of things not being done right is, and I think that's quite a stark result, actually.
And I wonder if we share enough of our stories about those issues, and particularly those ones early on in our careers that we've seen and needed some guidance on. So as you said, Dennis, you weren't the only person who had identified some of those issues. So
No.
People are seeing stuff, but do they have an environment where they feel they can act?
Yeah. So I mean, speaking truth to power is difficult. I mean, I don't think there's anyone, regardless of how senior you are, that says I'm bounding into work today because I'm going to challenge my boss and take them on. It's extraordinarily difficult.
You haven't met most of my staff.
Yeah. But once again, then it's incumbent on leaders to understand the power dynamic and how it works and the influence they have on people, and to create that environment where people feel as if they can challenge them.
People have also got to see leadership talking about, reflecting on, thinking about ethics and the moral compass of the organisation. Leaders almost need to pull these 57% of people towards them in terms of making them feel like there's a good conversation to be had here, rather than there being a cloud question mark over whether I should raise this or not.
Important. So let's move to question 3. In your opinion, are the recent scandals in the financial services industry due to bad systems, bad people, or both? Interesting split. 10% have said bad systems, 6% have said bad people, 84% have said both. So 1 in 10 still focusing on systems. So interesting insight there.
We tend to, there's something that psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. And what we do is whenever we see someone behave in a certain way in an environment, we tend to take a very dispositional view. So if I see Andy do something bad, my instant reaction is it must say something about Andy's character. However, if I'm in a situation where I do something bad, what I tend to say is it was the environment I was in, there was pressure, and that's why I behaved the way I did. And so that's always going to be our inclination as people. When we see someone do the bad thing, our natural inclination is going to be to look at them as an individual and say something about their character, rather than step back and think, what is it potentially about the environment or the system that person found themselves in that caused them to behave that way.
Right, we're now going to open up for some questions from the floor, and also some questions from our attendees watching the live stream online. So please do wait, pop your hand up, and please do wait for the microphone to get to you, so that if you have a loud voice, the microphone's needed so that we can pick that up for everyone on the webinar and live stream. So if anyone's got any questions from the panel, we'd love to get you engaged.
First of all, I love IT, but big organisations, and I'm not confining this to financial services, are going more and more for centralisation. And so I picked up on Dennis's point about purpose, because if the customer is a purpose, the customer almost fades into the background with centralisation. And when I go into a bank, about the only person I talk to is a teller, unless I want to go for a loan, and then the teller is generally under some pressure to sell what I'll call supplementary services like life insurance. So I think the centralisation, whilst it's enabled a certain amount of IT progress, has removed the purpose, which is service the customer, from all industries, not just banking or finance, is core role. So, panel opinion, please.
Yeah, I mean, and it's philosophers have spoken about this, and it's been proven in psychology that the more detached you are from an individual, the less bad you feel when something bad happens to them. So you're right that when, in large organisations, when we centralise people, it's difficult to connect them to the customer and to make them recognise what the purpose of the organisation is. I mean, and it's one of the many reasons why you tend to have a lot of incidents in financial markets, because traders sit behind screens looking at numbers, move all day. They don't actually see the connection between their actions and, the broader community. So that's one of the challenges for institutions, that when they articulate their purpose, whatever that purpose might be, how do you try and connect people to that? And it's not easy. Because, centralisation, one of the things that drives that is greater efficiency. And we should never forget the fact that ultimately organisations have to be profitable. Profit's not a dirty word, so you've just got to somehow find the right balance.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about technology, though, and in particular digital technology, is that the investment that banks are making into it is not just about efficiency for the sake of efficiency or productivity, but also because customers are demanding it. So 85% of our customers interact with us in some kind of digital or online form. And so creating customer choice means you need to create those channels and make them available for people. And yes, you could probably use the term centralisation in terms of managing the execution or service delivery when it's done through that channel, but it's also creating a better user experience for a lot of our customers, because they can access those services whenever they want, wherever they want. And in a time-poor world, and that's a lot of our customers live in a time-poor world, that's what they're asking for from us. So the challenge is, how do you get the balance right, because not every customer wants that, and not in not every situation either. So customers still want to engage with people when they're dealing with something that they perceive in particular as of higher risk to them. And what I perceive as a high-risk financial decision is going to be fundamentally to a whole range of people in this room. So it's how do you get that balance right?
Yeah, and look, I think it's a great point you raise. I think organisations will continue to try and get the balance right, meeting the demands of different kinds of customers. But, I'd argue that the same principles and the same frameworks that we've been talking about tonight still apply. Whether you've got a team of people building a very digitally focused self-service offering for a bunch of clients, or whether you've got a team of people out there in the front line sitting down across the table with customers, you still need principles, you still need the right culture, the right focus on doing the right thing to make both of those interactions fundamentally good for the customer.
Great, thank you. Is there a question over there?
Yeah, my name is Peter Saul. I chaired the Business Development Specialist Group for 19 years. And Dennis, you were the only one that had the courage to mention the word. You mentioned about having the moral courage to speak out emotionally and spiritually. Would you like to comment further on the word spiritually?
That's a big question. How long have we got, KP?
Yeah.
I mean, without getting into the religion, there is a spiritual component to this in terms we're talking about doing the right thing. There's a great actual piece of research that a famous behavioural psychologist called Dan Ariely was involved with, where he basically had people complete a pretty simple anagram, a task where they had to complete a mathematical equation essentially, and in one of them, he basically ran it under normal test conditions. In the next scenario, he had a shredder in the corner of the room, and he said to the participants, look, just go and shred your answer sheet and tell me what your result was. And, as you'd expect, the result shot through the roof because people cheated because they were getting paid for how many correct answers they got. In the next one, in the next scenario, he still had the shredder in the corner of the room, but he did two things. For some participants, he had a little comment at the top of the answer sheet that said that this piece of assessment is tied to the university's honour code, because they were conducting the experiment in a university. And for others, he had people list as many of the 10 commandments as he could. And regardless of which one of those two groups undertook the test, the results went back to baseline. They went back to when the test was run under normal test conditions. And what the researchers said was that the research basically showed how the reminder of the 10 Commandments or the reminder of the honour code drew participants' attention back to their moral obligations. And that's why one of the tactics that's been used by a lot of companies, speaking about digital solutions, is that they're trying to find the times when they're conducting the day-to-day work where they may be tempted, and they're trying to have the company's code of conduct or something pop up at that moment to remind them of their moral obligations. I think that sort of answers your question. I don't really want to dive into the whole spiritual religion thing, but ultimately there is a spiritual component to this because we are talking about what is the right thing to do. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to move to a question from the online observers. Charlotte is very kindly fielding the questions from our online community and for those people who are watching from the multiple locations around Australia and New Zealand.
Thank you, KP. We have a question from the webcast in Perth, and this is to all of the panel. And it says, panellists, do you think that these issues apply to the financial services industry in particular or equally to other industries also?
I think they're broadly applied. So, and like I think I mentioned in my speech, that be it drug taking in sports or phone hacking in journalism or what happened at Volkswagen, it's similar underlying themes that's driving all these incidents. And and the fact that banking and finance has been a bit of a repeat offender, like I said, I think says something about the system we've created within that industry. Why there tends to be far more unethical conduct in that industry versus others. But even in the car industry, with what happened at Volkswagen, there are other car companies that have been implicated as well. So, I think this broadly applies across all industries.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I think the types of behaviours that have featured in financial services are replicated elsewhere and under similar conditions. I think would be replicated in the same scale, but and maybe I'm taking it more personally because I've been in financial services all my life. I do think there are exacerbating features of financial services that seem to have, certainly from where I sit, made this worse. And I think of the repeated nature of some of the things that we've seen around mis-selling, about benchmark rigging. So even after it's been highlighted in one context, the next lot do it, or the next jurisdiction does it, or it goes on and on and on. And so I think, again, I may be wrong, but my sense is that we've been through a period where, for some reason, the environmental conditions created a more sort of dangerous ground for some of these behaviours. And, if you look at trading and risk management, it's probably the divorcing of the downside from people who are taking the risk. So people who took risk with bank balance sheets got all the upside, but they got none of the downside. So I think for risk management, that's been a feature. I think maybe even in the conduct space, certainly from investment banking where I came from, where some of the rewards could be really outsized, I think that then drives a greater risk that those behaviours, someone will make the risk-reward analysis, even if it's only subconscious, and decide, if this pays off, or if I convince myself this is okay, actually the payoff is that much greater. So I do think there were some conditions in financial services, may not have been as noticeable here as in London, but certainly in New York and London, I think the conditions were ripe, I think, for people to convince themselves they were actually, if not doing good things and not doing harm, when in fact they'd moved quite a long way from their kind of their own emotional and moral code.
Yeah, I definitely agree, although I dare say that if you looked into the Volkswagen incident, you'll find that there was an obsessive focus on targets, that people were rewarded for hitting certain targets, that senior leaders knew stuff and probably walked by and sent a message that, that type of conduct was condoned. So I think that's what I'm trying to say, that there are common themes there, but I do absolutely agree with you that there's something about the financial services system, which has really created a melting pot for this sort of conduct.
Look, and I'll go down the middle. I think financial services is one a small basket of kind of organisations that impact us every day, along with energy and along with food, etc., etc. And I think all of those organisations are increasingly coming under the spotlight. And you know, there are issues for all of them, maybe different or themes, but they're organisations that we care about because they impact us. And I think that they all struggle at different times in different ways with this ethics question.
And I think it's interesting though, I look at my own organisation, which I think is a highly ethical organisation. People are there for a purpose. So they come because they want to see the people who are doing the wrong thing go to jail, preferably. At least we'll catch up with them. They're not well paid. They're really modestly paid. They come face to face with the victims all the time. So everyone we deal with is face to face. So we don't deal with them online or, on the telephone very often. We actually have our investigators speak to every victim and every perpetrator. And so I think all of those things, these are all things that we've been talking about. And I think that results in a really ethical organisation and one that's very attractive to the people who work there despite the modest pay.
Yes. So I think one of the opportunities for us is to use this research and sector as a case study and to say, well, what are the learnings from this that we can go and apply in our own organisations and industries and not just in banking and financial services. So that brings the formal part of the evening to an end. So I'd very much like to thank our panellists. Please join with me in thanking Dennis Jinlun, Karen Silk, Rob Everett, Andy Simons and Julie Reid. Thank you. I really appreciate that they were able to take time out of what are very busy schedules, but also being brave enough to freely share their thoughts on what is a really important topic. I'd also like to finally acknowledge Melbourne University's Centre for Ethical Leadership, who partnered with us in writing this paper, and in particular Charlotte Everett from the Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand Leadership and Advocacy team, who took the lead on this piece of important work, and Bree Manning and our amazing Auckland events team for the great work that they've done in pulling this event together. Thank you, everyone. We hope you found tonight's discussion thought-provoking and insightful. You can access the paper online at charteredaccountantanz.com/Future Inc. or via the app. A very special thank you to our attendees who joined us online from all over Australia and New Zealand. We really appreciate you joining us via the webcast. And before we move to our favourite part of the day, where you can welcome to join us for networking, drinks and canapes downstairs on level 2, where registration was located, just want to comment on one of the learnings from the paper, and that it was the importance of ethical moments. And the challenge from us to you is to how will you take these issues back to your business and how will you keep the conversation going? Thank you. We look forward to seeing you at Future Inc. events, our next thought leadership events coming up. Safe travels, everyone. Good night.